Hello and welcome. In this video, I'll be covering the first 6 questions of the science test, which correspond to passage 1. With that being said, let me start off with question 1. Question 1 is asking us where on average is the brightest soil found, and it refers us to figure 2. Unfortunately, for copyright reasons, I won't be able to show you the original figures, but I will be able to sketch them. So in figure 2, the x-axis is showing us the inland distance in kilometers, and the y-axis is giving us a value of the soil brightness in terms of reflectance. Which assumes a value in between 0 and 100. So sketching the original figure, it looks something like this. And the little excerpt at the top of the figure tells us that the average brightness is given in terms of reflectance. So we know that the brighter the soil sample, the higher the reflectance value. And we can see that the highest reflectance value is around 75. And this corresponds to an inland distance of 0 kilometers, which is in fact the inland site. So the correct answer here is A. With that being said, let us move on to question 2. So question 2 is asking us for where the relative brightness of the dorsal stripe is closest to 1/4. So the subfigures in figure 1 are very similar to figure 2. The x-axis is still the inland distance in kilometers, but however, the y-axis is now a measure called brightness, and it assumes a value in between 0 and 1. So sketching out the subfigure for the dorsal stripe, it looks something like this. I'll mark with a dashed horizontal line where the brightness is always 1/4, and we're looking for the x value where it assumes a brightness of 1/4. So right here. In the original figure, this corresponds to an inland distance of 60 kilometers. So the best answer for this question is answer choice H. Alright, so moving on to question 3. Question 3 is asking us where the greatest change in the relative brightness occurred for the rostrum. So sketching out the brightness for the rostrum, we see something like this. And the little footnote at the bottom is telling us that the lightest values of fur pigmentation are assigned a value of 1. And the darkest values for fur pigmentation are assigned a brightness value of 0. So it makes sense that the steepest line segments in this figure would indicate the biggest change in fur pigmentation. So in my sketched figure, it would occur between these 2 points, because this is where the line segment is the steepest, thus indicating the largest change in fur pigmentation. In the original figure, this roughly corresponds to the inland locations in between 50 kilometers and 75 kilometers. So the correct answer choice is answer choice C. Alright, so let us move on to question 4. Question 4 is asking whether the fur pigmentation on the ventrum was lighter or darker at 150 kilometers than at 0 kilometers. So sketching out the fur pigmentation figure for the ventrum, it looks something like this. So we can clearly see that the value for the brightness at the inland distance of 0 kilometers is around 1, and at 150 kilometers, it assumes a value of 0. So we know that, from this information, we know that the fur pigmentation, as we move more inland, becomes darker. And this is because the value for the brightness is lower. So this corresponds to answer choice Answer choice J. All right. So question 5 is asking us to explain the most likely is asking us to explain the likely the trends that are shown in figures 1 and 2. And as a general rule of thumb, if we look at all the figures, we can see that there's a downward sloping correlation between distance and soil brightness in figure 2. And there's also a similar downward sloping correlation between distance and fur pigmentation, as seen in the various subfigures of figure 1. So the only explanation that makes sense is that as we move further inland, the mice with lighter pigmentation tend to blend into the soil, or the lighter soils, better. So this would make them less likely to be caught by predators and thus more likely to pass on their genetic information to offspring. And the answer that corresponds to this explanation would be answer choice B. All right, so let's move on to the very final question in this passage. And the very final question in this passage is asking us, is the surface soil sample at the coastal site lighter or darker than the standard that was used as a comparison? Once again, figure 2 has distance in kilometers on the x-axis. It goes from 0 to 150 kilometers. The value that is assumed by the y-axis goes between 0 and 100, and the units are average percent reflectance. And the graph looks something like this. Well, the question also tells us that the average brightness, the figure also tells us that the average reflectance at 0 kilometers is around 75. But the little footnote also tells us that it's compared to a standard that assumes a 100% value, or a reflectance value of 100. So this is in fact the lightest sample possible. So from this we can conclude that the inland soil, the soil at a distance of 0 kilometers is in fact darker than the standard used for comparison because the reflectance value is lower. And this corresponds to answer choice J. Whoops. This corresponds to answer choice J. All right, thank you for listening.